On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Indy Khare. He is the head of engineering at Convex. We're going to be talking about transitioning back to startups. Indy has the experience of working for other startups and fairly large company as well. He's going to walk us through some of what that process looked like for him, why he ended up back at a startup. I think some interesting points that he's going to make, and I think it's great for everyone who, is it a big company and is thinking about startups, or as a startup and wants to get an idea what a big company is like. I think Indy will kind of cover a lot of different areas for us, and I'm excited to have him on. Indy, thanks for being on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. Let's start off at the top with two things before we kick it off. One being, tell us what Convex does as a company, and then you're head of engineering. Just tell us what some of those responsibilities are, and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, for sure. So at Convex, we like to say we're building a application platform for developers. So we provide a custom database and an integrated execution environment. But what we like to say is, we want our customers to build products and not backends, right? So we're providing a full backend environment for you. So yeah, that's what we're doing. And as for me, as head of engineering, I think the funnest way to put it, I just make sure the trains are moving, right? So there's 100 things happening, and I just make sure they're all going in the right direction. Things are happening at the right time, and everyone's focused on the most important thing for the business.
Awesome. So this episode, we're going to be talking about, in your case, transitioning back to startup. And we'll have your LinkedIn in the show notes. So if somebody wants to go in and look at each of the chronology of your career, they could do that. But I guess really what we wanted to talk about on the episode was, that experience of being at a startup. In this case, you were at Bump, got acquired by Google. We can talk about Google and the scale, and then going back to a startup. I think some people kind of might see, hey, I've been to Google, where do I go? Some people are like, hey, I just like a startup mentality. There's a lot of stuff here that I think you kind of highlighted. I'd love to cover. I guess to start off, maybe actually let's talk about, without going too far back, but talk about that Bump Google acquisition, and just give us a little context of what that is, because obviously, you were at a startup before you guys got acquired.
Yeah. So Bump was an app back in the day. It was very popular. Maybe some of the younger listeners don't know about it now. But the idea was you'd bump two phones together and it would make a connection. And what that allowed people to do was exchange contact information, share photos, and all of that. We iterated on the product a bunch, and over time we realized photo sharing is sort of the big thing people want to do, and really this like private photo sharing, right? Like obviously there were social networks around, but we noticed that families and partners would share a lot of photos with each other through Bump, and so. To continue that vision, we basically ended up getting acquired by Google. So that's kind of the transition, basically. And it was an acqui-hire. We weren't going to necessarily continue working on the original product. There was definitely already ideas on floating around like building Google Photos within the company. We kind of like landed right in that mix of like as things were getting figured out.
Awesome. Yeah. And maybe just, you mentioned Google Photos. I told you before, I loved your line on LinkedIn. It says took Google Photos from 0 to 1 billion users. That's not something many people can say. It's a fun thing to say. Yeah, it's cool. It's really cool. I mean, I guess, you obviously left after being there 7 years. Maybe let's talk about that experience, right? So you went from a startup that got acquired to you're within Google. It's a different world. Like, I mean, there's so many things that change here, but I guess at a high level, maybe just let's start at the top. Obviously, you're going to have a lot more resources. You have you have a different framework, but also you're working on a product that was maybe not as well known. You mentioned 0 to billion. So to take us back, tell us what it looked like. Day one, you guys got acquired. You're there, and you're a Google employee now.
Yeah, for sure. So I was through the acquisition, we ended up at sort of, as I said, this like early days of as the company was starting to figure out what they wanted Google Photos to be. So a large chunk of what Google Photos was sort of existed at the company already as part of Google Plus. It was a feature within Google Plus, which had this feature called Instant Upload, where it would already be uploading some images for you, make it easier and faster to share them. And so there was this whole transition happening where the Android organization wanted a better default Photos experience, and obviously, with Google's mission to organize the world's information, Photos being this like huge area that wasn't organized within people's lives was an important just sort of extension of the mission for Google, right? So yeah, as there was obviously lots of things to figure out, but eventually we started working on it in 2014. And I ended up being the original tech lead of the Android app with a few folks from the acquisition and a few folks within the company, within Google already. And yeah, it was kind of fun to get a chance to build something from scratch, really. Obviously, as I said, there were some parts of the experience that already existed at Google, but we knew to really build the experience we wanted for this private photo library product. We had to build a lot of it from scratch, especially on the mobile side. So yeah, it was fun to go do that. And yeah, suddenly had a lot more resources, as you mentioned. So I remember early on just being super excited that there was even a QA organization, right? There's like people who did that, and who I could just talk to and figure things out with, set up plans and all of that, instead of just me sort of doing it on the side. So yeah, it was awesome to have all of that around so that we could kind of build. And obviously, Google Photos wouldn't have been possible because of just the huge compute powers and all the amazing AI research, image recognition research that was already at Google. So all of these things kind of came in and made this amazing product.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess, you mentioned the QA having that access to the resource. I mean, that's something at a startup, somebody's wearing that as an additional hat.
Right. Yeah. Basically, that was my other hat before. Yeah.
Exactly. I guess when you're kind of looking at that, and now you can kind of look back at it with different view of it, but you had a lot of resources, large scale. Everyone always is, not everyone, but a lot of people want to get to say, "Oh, I've worked at that large scale," but yet you left. And I guess kind of yada-yading a little bit of the years there, but getting to the point where you'd been there long enough, and I guess at some point. This product has matured. It's used by 1 billion people. I mean, it's widespread. That's got to feel good, but yet, I guess you weren't necessarily going to stay there forever. What was it that you were kind of missing there? What were you looking for that you started to think, okay, maybe a change is necessary?
Yeah, I think one thing as I've reflected on all this, I've realized is I've always really been a startup person. I love wearing many hats. I love just sort of figuring out something that no one else can, because there's just no one else there to do it, right? As Google Photos got bigger, more mature, I had people for all sorts of things taking care of great work. My teams had great leads and managers. And I just kind of felt that itch to start working on something that was growing quickly again, or starting from scratch, and possibly even. And it was 7 years is definitely a long time at a place too. And I definitely felt like I also just needed a break. So actually, between Google and Convex, I took a little over a year off. Just to give myself just a mental break before I jumped into something new.
Always needed. I guess as you were, evaluating that need for a break, it's something you've been there 7 years, and obviously you want to build. Did you stop to look at what other opportunities there were within Google? Was it a decision that I've been working for this big company. I need a wholesale change. Was that an option, or was it more or less you felt like you should just left straight away?
No, I definitely looked around a little bit. At the moment, I just didn't quite find the magic of something like a Google Photos, and it's really hard. It's kind of a rare thing for a confluence of things to come together, something like Google Photos. So, I just was looking for something that felt high impact, felt that's something I could just go run and execute on, and that was also sort of like blue sky, a lot more blue sky, right? Mm-hmm. The term we've talked about earlier. And I just didn't quite find the right balance for myself there. And as I said, I also just needed a break. So between all of that, I decided to just leave and give myself some time.
Makes sense. And I guess, as you took a break and you were looking to get back into it, you mentioned, obviously, we talked about blue sky and, you want to have that opportunity to build, builders like to build. Mm-hmm. When you were evaluating opportunities, I am positive there was no shortage of companies that you could have joined. How were you going about evaluating? Because that's always interesting to me, right? Like, what are you seeing within, obviously you ended up at Convex, but what are you seeing that goes, hey, I can be a part of that. I can see myself, being a builder again, and I'm going to build this product.
Yeah, for sure. So to be honest, given sort of how much I'd grown at Google, my first thought was to just look at another sort of high growth startup, right? So startup that's now in this phase of like really growing out. It's like, oh, I've done that, and that might be something I can help out some other company in. And so I definitely talked to a few of those folks. I had one exception in my mind for going to something really, really early stage. Even though I wanted to do that, it's hard to find something early stage that you kind of that sort of like checks all your boxes, right? Because it is riskier and all of that, right? And in my case, it was really important to me that the people at this, because when I joined Convex, it was just a team of 4, right? People at that stage were just high integrity, so a way for me to evaluate that. And obviously the product being something that was just personally interesting, exciting for me. And so Convex hit those boxes. So Jamie Turner was the CEO of Convex. I'd worked with him previously at Bump, actually. He definitely has stuck out in my mind over the years, just like an incredible person to work with, high integrity, incredible engineer, all of that. So I just love that sort of box to check for me. And then in terms of the product, in my time off, I tried to build things because that's kind of what some of us do. And I realized there was still this need in the market for a backend that sort of abstracts a lot of things away from you and just gives you the right set of tools and abstractions that you need to build new products. And once Jamie sort of pitched the vision to me, I realized like, oh, I want to use that. And that's important for me, is to feel like there's something I work on that I want to use, or at least I feel like I can understand the problem well enough that I can push it forward, right? I can push the solution forward. And Absolutely. So, it hit those boxes for me. And so I decided to just jump in.
There you go.
Yeah.
I guess I was just thinking, 7 years at Google, you didn't have to wear that QA hat anymore. You're going back to a company of, single digits, double, or low teens, and all of a sudden you don't have the same resources, the same benefits, perks. You don't have the team size. You don't have that QA department. When you were going back, and I know you're a startup guy, but 7 years is a long time to get used to something. If you said, hey, Indy, I'm going to turn off your hot water for the next couple of years, you can live without it. You'll get used to lukewarm, cold water showers. It'll be okay. You probably would think I'm insane, but I know you're a startup guy. How did you kind of cope with, you're going to lose some of those additional resources that a smaller company couldn't afford to provide yet?
Yeah, it's interesting. And maybe this is sort of being a startup person sort of a thing. Well, I didn't think that hard about it, maybe.
Yeah. Right.
In that, like, I was happy. That's probably the honest answer. I was happy to just be in a place where we have to figure out things from first principles again, because, it's a different type of product than the type of product I've worked on. So thinking about QA or, a bunch of other things, product design, product management, everything sort of feels pretty different in this type of product. And so that opportunity to learn all of that from first principles was just exciting enough for me that I guess I didn't think that deeply about like missing those resources. Obviously, there are definitely times where I am looking forward to when we're big enough. I'm like, oh, I'd be happy to, now that I understand this world, I'm happy to hand this off to someone, but we'll get there. But as I said, I enjoy wearing different hats. I enjoy figuring out new things. When I joined Convex, I ended up like hiring our first few contractors, figuring out, doing product design, doing product management stuff. I ran recruiting before we had our head of talent for a little bit. And so, it's just, you get to go try all of these different things within the company. And I just enjoy sort of being able to shift between different roles like that. So, yeah.
I like that. I guess, from your point of view, I know that I don't think there's a right answer to this question, but from your point of view, I guess as companies grow, you're going to get more refined responsibilities. There's going to be departments, you're going to get QA department, all these things happen. But I think I've spoken to enough engineers over the years to know that a lot of them enjoy building. A lot of them enjoy solving problems. And some of the reasons behind them wanting to leave is they want to find a new problem to solve. I guess, as you're looking at yourself and just, what you found interesting is, how does a company avoid that being the inevitability? It seems hard because obviously as the product grows, there's, maybe less new development, maybe less multiple hats, but yet we kind of all know this is something engineers like. I mean, not all engineers, I'm just kind of talking generalities, but how do you kind of, how could that be avoided?
I think you're right to say that to a certain extent it can't be, but I think as a manager, right, you want to try to give people as much autonomy as possible, right? So give them the encouragement to be like, hey, you should just go figure this out, or you should just go drive this problem, even if there's someone else who sort of like like a QA department or whatever, right? But like, someone has to glue it all together, right? You can't just like throw things over the wall. Even in large organizations like Google, someone has to go and get everyone in the same room and figure all those pieces out. So you then, through that process, to keep getting that exposure to these different things, and the opportunity you always have is to stitch all these things together, make a cohesive plan or a goal that you're trying to get to.
That's fair. I think it's interesting because I think as you're a builder, you move up through that engineering career ladder, and then you become a manager, and all of a sudden you got into engineering because you like problem solving, and that little burning desire could dwindle, and you wanted to rekindle. And managers necessarily that allure of I guess management. There's a lot of problem solving, but it's not no longer technological. It's a lot more people management problems you're solving. It's just very different. And I think that's an interesting thing because you still had a ton of people management responsibilities, but that multiple hat, because you said it a couple of times, is what you kept coming back to, being able to have that diversity in thought within yourself.
Right. Yeah. So what I sometimes told people when they were asking about growth and all of that, right, as a manager, we have these conversations. One thing I told them that, okay, maybe as you're a great engineer, but you also have some interesting product intuitions that are valuable and interesting, is that one thing I told people was that as you grow, and this is sort of what I observed, as you grow in your career and as you sort of take on more responsibilities, as you pair up with more peers in other organizations, these lines like product design, engineering actually are fuzzier at the higher levels than we all like to think. Obviously, we have our core duties to follow, but when you're in the room and hashing things out together, you're all kind of providing, your own perspective and input. It isn't that just because I'm, the engineering lead or engineering manager, I'm going to just stop at telling you what is or isn't technically possible. I might actually be able to say, hey, because I understand the technical aspects here fairly well, I can provide some insight into what is possible with the product that maybe, the PM or the designer or whatever isn't necessarily thinking about. And on the other hand, right, sometimes like designers and PMs sort of like push you to try something that you didn't really necessarily think was possible, or at least like worth spending time on, when they sort of like present like, well, here's the business case, or here's this like incredible interaction we'll be able to have if we try it. And you're like, okay, well, let me actually like spend some time and explore that as well. So it's always this, you're in these rooms where you're all providing input on different aspects of the business, right? And so so as you grow, those opportunities sort of actually are still there.
Interesting. I think that's actually, you mentioned the lines become fuzzier within that room. I think that's actually a really good observation. I guess from the flip side of that, I think we've kind of joked about, wearing multiple hats, and you had a different view of, at being a Google, of how things are formally run. When you're actually now thinking, okay, well, Convex is going to grow and I'm going to divest myself of some of these hats at some point. How do you prioritize that? Because that always is the other tricky part as a startup, is knowing which hat to give up at what point.
I think, one signal for me is when I feel like I understand the problem well enough, right? So when I hand it off, I will be able to know if it's being done well or not, right? And the other time is sometimes it's just opportunistic, right? Sometimes you just find someone who's just so much better at it, and actually over time you really want that to happen, right? You want to find someone who's just so much better at that than you are, where they come and tell you, like, hey, actually the way you've been doing this isn't actually the best way to do it. I mean, this happened with our head of talent, who we hired a few months ago. For a brief period of time, I was just treading, right? I was just barely like reading all the resumes and making some calls. And he came in my first meeting with him, he's like, I got all of this. I'll just take care of this whole set of things you're doing. And I'm going to make sure we do all these follow-ups properly and set up a process here that you haven't set up. I'm like, great, do it. Right. Like I did that for a bit because we needed it. And it gave me an opportunity to learn new things. But once you get that expert in the room, you just know how much better your business is going to be because of it. And you just want to hand things off. It just feels great.
Awesome, man. I like that. I think that's great advice. I think people sometimes struggle with that. It's not easy to give up control, or when to give up control. But as you mentioned, when somebody can do it better, that's obviously no better time. Thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I think you have a super interesting background, and you're a builder. So I was super excited to have you to come on and talk about this.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before I let you go, I like to ask all my guests this question, and that is, if you could ask a future guest on this show to cover a topic for you, what topic would you be curious to learn about more?
There's this sort of like classic problem in engineering management around like when teams should be sort of functional or product oriented, right? So horizontal or vertical, different people use different words. And I just like, I have an opinion on when things need to switch back and forth. But it's definitely something I love hearing from other folks on when they think that time comes. And because there's a variety of situations in different companies, and I haven't had all the experiences in the world, right? And so it's always hearing different people's take on that.
Absolutely. That's a good one. And if somebody does want to reach out to you to talk to you about anything you've mentioned on the podcast, what's a good way of getting a hold of you?
Yeah, as you mentioned, my LinkedIn will be in the podcast notes, right? But beyond that, I am also on Twitter. So you can find me at IKHARE, Ikhare. So first letter of my first name, last name. And yeah, it's easy enough, hopefully.
Awesome, man. Thanks again for being on. Super fun conversation. I can't thank you enough.
Thanks.
All right. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you yourself or you know somebody that can talk about, how do teams get structured, functional versus product, horizontal, vertical, I think it's a great conversation, especially if you've seen it in different environments at different scales. I think it'd be great to have you on the show. And secondly, if you found the podcast useful, share it with somebody else you know. Give it a rating wherever you listen to it. That's how we've been growing organically. I can't thank everyone enough for doing that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.